really happy to have the chance to be part of this, and moderate the discussion. Just a word of history here. Alfonso, I've known Alfonso before, and I have to call him Alfonso. I cannot call him Dr. Gonzales, which he is, and professor, but I mean, 17 years, right? About 17 years.
Not much?
Yes.
I think you feel old over here.
Well, you are. You are.
You just shattered my...
So your self-image has to change now. So anyhow, I'm very pleased. I'm extraordinarily proud of Alfonso. When he first came here, and his background as working class, Chicano brother who sometimes went down the wrong paths, but always asking tough questions. And he used to drive me nuts because he would always ask, when is is this revolutionary or not? So I'm like, come on, brother, go to Stanford. And he did. And he came back tamed. Relatively. But anyhow, it's a real pleasure for me because he's not only, a student of mine, was a doctoral. Mark Sawyer and I were his co-chairs for his dissertation, and the book, of course, Reform Without Justice, which you haven't bought. They're back there, and you can buy them. It's doing extraordinarily well, and it is not the dissertation. I mean, it is substantially rewritten, and so on. And somebody asked me, well, is it the dissertation? I said, no, because I signed off on the dissertation, and it's not that. So it's a wonderful book. I don't want to take a lot of time to introduce the commentators, but the reason I was so excited about the project, and a lot of folks are, is because Alfonso has chosen to a different path than traditional political science, which is very conservative generally. Certainly my department is for the most part, and very orthodox. The boundaries, the disciplinary boundaries of political science, what Alfonso has done is challenge those and extend them, and particularly relying on Gramsci. And I'm happy to say that I think his first exposure to Gramsci was in my class.
Yes.
So, and so it's a really thorough, theoretically sound work, and so I'm very happy that he asked me to just moderate and introduce him. So very proud of you, and congratulations for Alfonso's currently assistant professor at Lehman College in New York. A radically different experience for him when he first got there. Not only the weather, of course, but and he has been active in organizing work there and doing research as well. So I don't really want to belabor all of that. And he's also begun a second work, extending but reformulating what he's doing here. So I hope we're going to see that in a couple of years, if not sooner. So let me introduce Lisa Bravo. She's assistant professor in Chavez Center, Cesar Chavez Department of Chicano Studies. She's a sociologist and writes about the lived experiences of immigration laws and gendered ideals on immigrants and their families. And she just got a book published. Congratulations. So, yeah, this is another one, right? So,
buy one, get one free.
And soon we'll have a slew of other books coming by. So her book is called Sacrificing Families, Navigating Laws, Labor, and Love Across Borders. And it was published by Stanford University Press this year, I believe, in January. I have not read the book, but I've read, I think, all the articles that she's written, very important interventions in Latino studies and in sociology, which really give us a very different perspective on things. So I'm very happy to, and congratulations again. And Dr. Alvaro Huerta, returning to UCLA as undergrad here, visiting a scholar now at UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center, He's an interdisciplinary scholar of urban planning and Chicano studies. He conducts research on community development, immigration, social movements, gender, labor niches. And he also authored a book, I believe it came out last year, 2013, entitled Reframing the Latino Immigration Debate Towards a Humanistic Paradigm. And that was by San Diego State University. And apparently he's also working on a forthcoming edited volume on migration and immigration. So, and his PhD is from UC Berkeley, the city and regional planning. So I'm very happy to be part of this and to present you, and let's get on with, I'm assuming that you're going to be talking about the book. Yeah. So Alfonso, help me welcome.
So thank you, everyone. This is a really warm homecoming. It's so nice to see so many people who were really instrumental in my intellectual formation, starting with, of course, Professor Rocco, who first introduced me to Gramsci, Professor Hernandez. When I started here, I was an undergrad, and she was a graduate student, and I was so impressed by her, even as she was a graduate student. Professor Tu Nguyen Vu, who deepened my understanding of Foucault, Gramsci, and Poulantzas and political theory. She teaches in East Asian languages. Asian languages and cultures. Maybe the name has changed over time. But she was a political scientist. Not everyone knows she's a political scientist. But had one seminar had a huge impact on me. Professor Valenzuela. Again, it's great to see all of you here, Professor Frazier. So, with no further ado, and of course, all of my colleagues who were graduate students who are now young professors, like Professor Gutierrez, Celia, I can go on and on, Sylvia. I won't name everyone because there's too many people in the room. So, it's great to be back presenting my book, Reform Without Justice, Latino Migrant Politics in the Homeland Security State. And something fell off here. This book is a book on the relations of force. That is the relationship between the Latino migrant movement and the Homeland Security State. And I say Latino migrant movement as a shorthand of talking about the Latino sector of the broader immigrant rights movement. The immigrant rights movement, the way I conceive it in my book, is a multiracial, multinational, global migrant movement that's composed of a variety of organizations. But in this book, I'm really concerned with the conjuncture between 2001 and 2012. And this is a conjuncture in which we see an intensification of deportation against Latino community, against immigrants in general, but in particular against Latino communities. We've seen the number of deportations go from 188,000 in the year 2000 to 419,000 in the year 2012. 419,000 deportations. So, in this moment, this is a tremendous moment. I don't want to write about it. I didn't want to write about this moment as simply a moment of state repression and state violence, but I also wanted to write about this as a moment of tremendous resistance, right? Because even though there's this tremendous increase in deportations, there's also an inspirational period that I think we're going to look back to this period in 30 years the way we look back at the Chicano movement today, or the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement. We're going to look back at this period, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of scholarship on this period in which, yes, there is an increase in state violence towards migrants, but it's also a period of great organizing and resistance. That's why I have this picture here of the 2006 mega marches. Hoy marchamos, mañana votamos. Today we march, tomorrow we vote. And remember this moment, a moment in which the Latino migrant movement was able to organize, mobilize mass protests throughout the United States. The estimations on this vary. I don't think anyone really knows how many people came out. Some scholars put it to 4 million, some scholars say 2 million, but anywhere from 2 to 4 million people came out in over 120 cities throughout the United States, from Chicago to Dallas to LA to the Bay Area, New York City. So this is a moment of tremendous organizing, but also a moment of tremendous domination, right? A tremendous repression against immigrant communities. So the questions that are the guiding questions in the book are, what forces are driving draconian migration control policies? And why is it that despite its success in mobilizing millions, the Latino migrant movement and its allies have not been able to more successfully defend the rights of migrants? What will it take for the Latino migrant movement and its allies to win sustainable and transformative social justice victories? And by justice, I'm deploying justice here in the sense put forth by the political theorist Iris Marion Young, who refers to justice as the elimination of domination and human suffering. So I'm not talking about short-term victories like a victory to get less cooperation between ICE and local police in county jails or victories such as DACA. I'm talking about transformative and sustainable social justice victories that actually begin to undo the structures of state violence that we've seen deployed against immigrant communities. And this project, again, emerged because of frustration. Frustration with the actual state of affairs facing immigrant communities, but also a frustration with the scholarly literature on this issue. Most of the literature on migration control, and there's great literature on this, I mean, I'm thinking of people like Timothy Dunn, who militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm thinking of the work of Wayne Cornelius on the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm thinking of the work of our own Otto Santana on metaphors and anti-immigrant sentiments in the New York Times. Most of the work on migration control and anti-immigrant policies, with the exception of Otto Santana, I wouldn't put him in this category, but most of the work that's done on migration control assumes that you have this monstrous state apparatus that's just repressing migrants, but there really isn't much migrant resistance. There really isn't much organizing that's being done in the face of this leviathan of state violence. So that was my frustration with the migration control literature. And we can add to that the work of Peter Andreas, many people, and I won't bore you with all the literature, but there's a lot of work that focuses pretty much on the enforcement side of this relations of force between the state and the migrant movement. Okay, and my other frustration was with the race and politics literature, in particular the Latino politics literature. The Latino politics literature is really effective and precise, and we've developed in Latino politics research, developed really precise and effective mechanisms, tools for studying Latino political behavior, Latino voter patterns, public opinion amongst Latinos. But the Latino politics literature is very much a reflection of American politics as a field within political science. So it's very much focused at the behavioral level and at the institutional, but there really isn't an analysis of the context for this Latino political behavior. Yes, we know Latinos are coming out to vote. Yes, we know Latinos are more likely to vote Democrat. Yes, we know that Latinos respond to the framing of how media personalities might frame the immigration debate. But there isn't necessarily anything in the Latino politics literature that's getting to the relationship between the Latino migrant movement, which is a significant part of studying Latino politics today, and this larger contradictory apparatus of migration control. So to capture both the structures of state violence, but also the agency of Latino migrant activists, I turned to Gramsci. Okay? And Gramsci gives us a way to conceive this conjuncture, this moment, if you will, this moment of struggle between the Latino migrant movement and what I call the Homeland Security State. It allows us to conceptualize this in ways that traditional American political scientists, traditional Latino politics as a subfield of American politics doesn't necessarily allow us to conceive. So for instance, in American politics, it's very much about the government, the institutions of governance, the presidency, local community, local governing bodies, municipal governments, Congress, political parties, etc. But it doesn't necessarily focus on the relationship between the political and the social. And we have to resolve, I mean, where does, there used to be this field of study called political sociology that was very much about understanding the relationship between the social and the political. So what Gramsci allows us to do is to think about, I wish I had a pointer, but what Gramsci allows us to do is to think about immigration politics within the context of the state sphere, the political and juridical sphere of government, but also the spheres of civil society in relation to the economic moment which we're living, which is a moment defined by neoliberalism. And if you look at the Latino politics literature, I would challenge you to find in the traditional Latino politics literature to find a discussion about neoliberalism and Latino politics. It pretty much doesn't exist unless Ray Rocco wrote it. Or I wrote it, but for the most part, there's very few literature that's talking about the relationship of, yes, Latinos and Latino elected officials, Latino public opinion in relationship to what? To the neoliberal moment, a neoliberal moment that's precarious and that is in crisis. So this is what Gramsci allows us to do. So I draw on this Gramscian framework. I draw on critical discourse analysis to study what it is that government, that those within the governing institutions are saying about immigrants. I look at deliberative institutions. I look at Congress. I look at local government institutions in Riverside County, for instance. I look at elements of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus. But this framework also allows us to do critical discourse analysis of the civil society institutions that are involved with the immigration debate. So, for instance, like the Center for Immigration Studies, where would the Center for Immigration Studies fall in a traditional approach to political science where we're just looking at the state apparatus itself, for instance? Okay. So, on top of the discourse analysis, I also do critical ethnography. And critical ethnography, similar to critical theory, draws its inspiration actually from critical theory. And like critical theory, the reason for critical theory, and unapologetically, critical theory is about theorizing social relations for human liberation. So critical ethnography is ethnography, but with an explicitly critical view of the world, right? One that seeks to get to those sites of power where people are struggling for human liberation. And this is a necessary method within my methodological toolkit for getting to the kinds of questions that I get to in my research, in particular into this book. Okay, so I do interviews with 60 migrant activists and policymakers in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., New York City. I also do interviews with deportees and policymakers in El Salvador and Mexico. Okay. And what I argue in the book is that, so to go back to the question before we go to the argument again. So in a nutshell, the question is, why hasn't the Latino migrant movement and its allies, the non-Latinos, who are also part of the immigrant rights movement, why hasn't the Latino migrant movement and its allies been able to stop the deportation, state violence against migrants, despite its efforts to do so? And I say it's because the Latino migrant movement is up against a type of political power that I call anti-migrant hegemony. And this is not the kind of political power that you're going to say that there's the Democrats have a majority and the Republicans have a minority. That's not anti-migrant. Anti-migrant hegemony is ideological and political leadership that rationalizes state violence against migrants as a common sense and race-neutral, sound public policy. And this consensus, if you will, it's not just found in Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate. It's definitely there, without a doubt. But it's rooted in civil society. And the way that this hegemonic leadership over the immigration debate has emerged has precisely been by the criminalization of migrants. Because what the criminalization of migrants does is that it builds consent for militarized migration control policies, and it divides immigrant communities into good immigrants who deserve some type of legalization and bad immigrants who must continue to be policed. But more so, this discourse, right, this hegemonic discourse, this is the most critical part of my work, I believe, that it obfuscates the neoliberal model driving migration and reinforces the structures of state violence used against migrants to the detriment of democracy for all. Because this is not just about immigrant rights, folks. This is about democracy. And can you live in a democracy that's deported 4 million people since 1990? These are the kinds of questions that I believe we need to start asking. These are the questions that I raise in the book. So let me unpack this, if you will. So the way I conceive of the anti-migrant, the way I conceive of anti-migrant hegemony happening. So thus far, this concept of anti-migrant hegemony, thus far it's not that different than, let's say, Leo Chavez's Hispanic Latino threat narrative, right? Most of us have read probably Leo Chavez, but do you know Leo Chavez? Leo Chavez, there's this anti-Latino narrative, it's in society, but there's no one producing it per se, it has an agency of its own. And it's for Leo Chavez, it's all in civil society. For me, anti-migrant hegemony, I use anti-migrant hegemony because where there's hegemony, there's social classes and political forces that are struggling for power. And I conceive of these forces as an anti-migrant bloc. And I want to be clear, the anti-migrant bloc is not a homogeneous, it's not a homogeneous group that's out there doing all the anti-immigrant policies. It's a heterogeneous and contradictory constellation of actors that operate both at the level of the state, in the green, state sites of power, but also in civil society and in cooperation and in support with strategic fractions of capital that are vested in the continuation and perpetuation of the Homeland Security State. So let me just kind of elaborate on some of these sites of power. This is where the Gramscian framework really comes into play, because it allows us to look at all of these sites of power and think about the relationship with respect to immigration policy. So at the state level, I'm thinking, of course, the executive office. I put the Gang of Eight to signify the House. In the House, the Senate. The House Immigration Reform Caucus to signify the anti-migrant groups working in the House the House of Representatives. But I'm thinking specifically about the role. One of the things I elaborate on in the book is on the intellectual power. It's not rooted in just electoral power, but it's the intellectual, the moral and intellectual leadership. This is where Gramsci talked about hegemony as being moral and intellectual leadership. The moral and intellectual leadership over the immigration debate of anti-migrant forces in civil society. So groups like the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the Center for Immigration Studies, nativist academics like Samuel Huntington, and many, many less distinguished Samuel Huntingtons that are out there that we might not know about, but they're out there nonetheless. Let me tell you, there's a lot of them. There's a lot. Some are hidden, but some are quite open about their Huntington-esque views. But I also think about, and I also write about the role of media personalities. Groups like the Heritage Foundation, they have published a tremendous amount of, I'm not going to call it scholarly literature, but published a tremendous amount of public policy literature that, unlike our own academic work, which is usually read by other academics and academic journals, by graduate students, that's very much is being used within the state apparatus for rationalizing and justifying the expansion of authoritarian migration control policies. Okay? But I also, one of the strengths of the Gramscian approach is it allows us to think about the nexus, because I don't think of it as just the state. No, it's a state-civil society nexus, a nexus with the state and civil society, where strategic fractions of capital fund a lot of these groups. So I'll give you an example. What all these groups have in common, with the exception of CNN, is that they all get foundation money from the Scafee Foundation. And the Scafee Foundation is a conservative foundation. And not only do they fund groups like Center for Immigration Studies, Federation for American Immigration Reform, Numbers USA, and a host of other nativist organizations, but they also fund groups like the American Enterprise Institute and the Cato Institute. They also fund the neoliberal think tanks that are out there pushing for continuation of free trade policies, of a neoliberal thinking more broadly. The Heritage Foundation is a good example of that. But if you look at it, you can just Google the Scafee Foundation's grantees, and you'll see who they're giving money to. So this is a contradictory constellation of forces. I'm not acting as if, or pretending in the book, as if the Cato Institute thinks exactly like the Heritage Foundation, or if the Heritage Foundation thinks exactly like Center for Immigration Studies. In fact, there might even be friction between some of these organizations. But the general consensus amongst these organizations, is that we need more authoritarian solutions to the migration problem, as they frame it, as an immigration problem, immigration crisis, if you will. That's the consensus amongst them. But like I said, for Gramsci, hegemony is not just consensus amongst the dominant groups, but it's when dominant groups can gain moral and intellectual leadership over allied and subordinate groups as well. And this is what, again, I think a unique feature of the book, if you will, because I'm sure there'll be books out there that write all about the nativist forces, that write all about border enforcement, that write all about ICE, for instance. But I also want to write about the role of immigrant rights activists and how immigrant rights activists have framed their own rights claims. And I believe that the anti-migrant bloc has been able to gain hegemonic leadership over the immigration debate and really established a leadership over the immigration debate to the point that immigrant rights activists have begun to cast their demands in the very language used by the anti-immigrant right or the anti-migrant bloc. I'll give you an example. This is from Frank Sherry, who is the head of the National Immigration Forum. And Frank Sherry, folks, I mean, he has a long history of activism. He was part of CISPIS. I mean, Frank Sherry is not a middle of the road. Well, he is now, but he doesn't have a history of being a middle of the road liberal. This is someone with strong credentials in different solidarity movements, etc. But even Frank Sherry concedes to this moral intellectual leadership. So this is Frank Sherry before the 109th Congress. And while we certainly need tighter, more targeted, and more effective enforcement as part of a comprehensive overhaul, the fact is that over the last 2 decades, the enforcement approach has failed miserably. Okay, that makes sense. Instead, however, that's my however, instead of enforcement only, we need enforcement first. We need an enforcement plus approach. So this is a prime example, and I give many examples throughout the book, where immigrant rights activists make these types of arguments where they basically reinforce the consensus that we need more authoritarian immigration control enforcement of the nativist right, of the anti-migrant bloc, as part of their maneuvering to win some type of immigration reform. Okay. The biggest problem with this debate, I understand that to a certain, and I acknowledge this throughout the book, that for us to a certain level, there is a practical necessity to frame the immigration debate in such a way that you could create some type of negotiation. I understand that. And what I argue throughout the book, as long as that continues to be the case, immigration reform might give relief from deportation for certain people. But immigration reform, if we continue to fight for immigration reform along these lines, immigration reform will not bring about justice. It will never bring about justice. If we conceive of justice as the way that Iris Marin Young conceived of justice, as the elimination of human suffering and domination. And it's precisely because this immigration debate obfuscates, completely looks over the structural forces that have been driving migration over the last 30 years. And I'm not going to go through all of the free trade agreements that have been signed by Mexico and other Latin American countries since the 1980s. But I was going to give you this graph, and I think it's quite obvious that we see, this is the Mexican-born population in the US from 1850 to 1870. And we see that this population had its ebbs and flows, right? Steadily been rising. But in the 1970s, it goes from roughly 2 million people to 14 million Mexican-born people who were born in Mexico living in the United States. What is this? What is this? How do you account for this increase? But you can only account for it if you have an analysis of political economy. If you have an analysis of the global economic restructuring that not only happens in Mexico, but happens in El Salvador, happens in Dominican Republic, that happens in Ecuador. I mean, one of the great things about being in New York, I can show you clearly, if I actually have the data, I just don't use it on the slides, but I can reproduce this same graph using Ecuadorian migration and during the same period, Dominican migration during the same period. That coincides with the implementation of neoliberal reforms in Latin America. The immigration debate completely overlooks that. As in fact, I would add that at this moment when there's all this discussion about immigration reform in Congress today, and we can talk about the specifics of that later, that there is no discussion of the links between neoliberalism, free trade policies, and migration. Nowhere in the dominant institutions of power, in the state institutions of power. In fact, what is on the table right now? The Transatlantic Partnership for Trade and Investment, the Trans-Pacific Partnership for Trade and Investment. We're talking about free trade deals that are going to make NAFTA look parochial. Okay, I'm serious. We're talking about free trade deals with 17 countries, with the European Union, United States, Mexico, and Canada. Somehow that has not been, it gets completely overlooked in the immigration debate. And it gets overlooked for these material reasons. As long as this continues to be the case, reform proposals such as the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, Immigration and Modernization Act, and most CIR bills, because I don't want to make it just about S744, most immigration reform bills may bring relief from deportation for a small sector of people who qualify, but they won't bring about justice. In fact, They will continue to obfuscate the structural conditions that have led to mass migration, but most critically, they will reinforce the structures of state violence. Because within the entire immigration debate, if you look at the last 8 to 10 immigration reform proposals, going back from the Fox-Bush talks of 1999 to 744, all of the immigration reform bills, and in the essence, propose some type of limited legalization for a limited, highly selective sector of the population in exchange for more border militarization. 744, for instance, included a border surge that is 20 times bigger than Plan Mexico, 20 times bigger than Plan Colombia. It's a $40 billion aid package. It's literally 20 times bigger than the military aid package that we gave Mexico in 2008. This is how tremendous this border surge is. So almost all immigration reform proposals propose this legalization in exchange for militarization dynamic. And I love this candid moment with Senator Lindsey Graham that I cite in the book, where he says, "Hell, half my family wouldn't qualify," in respect to the requirements to get the resident provisional immigrant status, the RPI status that was being advanced in 744. So what this has done is this has essentially divided the immigrant rights movement between what I conceive as immigration reformers, that is immigrant rights activists that are very much towing the line, if you will. I mean, just to hurry up and get to discussion. These immigration reformers reproduce the hegemonic discourse of the anti-migrant bloc, and they're very much part, remember when I showed you that state civil society nexus, they're very much in conversation with these dominant groups in jockeying to position themselves to support reform proposals like 744. I interviewed a lot of these folks. I interviewed people from National Council, La Raza, Center for American Progress. These would be immigration reformers. And they were all very clear, and you can see it especially in chapter 5 in the book, where they're saying, look, we don't have the luxury to pick and choose what immigration reform proposal is there. If we can get the votes, we're going to support it. And that, although I understand that they're being practical, but that is that ideological thinking is one that continues to push us in this direction, where if we have reform, it may bring relief, but it won't bring about justice. And you have the oppositional migrant activists that I write about throughout the book as well. And the oppositional migrant activists are making rights claims, and you can't homogenize any of these groups. You can't homogenize immigration reformers or oppositional groups, but the oppositional migrant activists, this is a group based out of the Bronx, a group of street vendors. They're talking about we need to change not just an immigration policy, but U.S. foreign policy. There's groups here in Los Angeles, they're talking about the rights of indigenous migrants, not immigrants, indigenous migrants. These types of rights claims are rights claims that are not necessarily going to be well received within the state civil society nexus that I showed you a minute ago, but these are rights claims that are really counter-hegemonic rights claims that if we take them serious, they really get to the essence of what's going on right now with respect to trade policy, neoliberalism, and the sovereignty of the nation state. Okay. I'm going to skip this slide for the sake of I want to get to the commentary. If we continue on this path where we have this really what it is a monstrous immigration enforcement apparatus, right? The Homeland Security State. If we continue to leave this constellation of institutions, it's not just the DHS and ICE, but it's also its civil society components as well. They very much give it an intellectual power. If we continue to allow this arrangement to dictate the direction of not just immigration policy, but a whole other set of policies as well, then we're in a situation that Nikos Poulantzas described as authoritarian statism. If you haven't heard of Nikos Poulantzas, that's okay. A lot of American academics have it. But Nikos Poulantzas is really a political sociologist, studied under Althusser, and did a tremendous intervention, probably one of the most important interventions of the 20th century in political Marxism. That is Marxism of the state, not just Marxist economics. And Nikos Poulantzas, for him, authoritarian statism is a new form of governance that was emerging with the rise of neoliberalism. And it's really funny because Nikos Poulantzas was writing about this in the late 1970s. And what he first saw was the emergence of neoliberal regimes in which you would have the appearance of you would have the existence of the formal institutions of representative democracy. So it would look like a democracy. There's elections, there's courts, there's a system of checks and balances. But ultimately, these systems would become more authoritarian. You would have a curtailing of civil liberties and the rise of authoritarian police practices. Look no further than not just what's happening on our borders, but what's happening with NSA, what's happening with our cell phones, what's happening with our computers, what's happening with cyberspace, etc. You'd have this curtailing of civil liberties and a growing consensus amongst the dominant political parties. And one of the things that I put forth in the book, one of the arguments I put forth in the book, is that the lines between Democrats and Republicans are not as thick as we would like to think in the mainstream media. In terms of the overall, there's a policy consensus that we need drones, that we need more border enforcement. People have to subjugate themselves to biometric IDs, etc. They might debate the tactics over how far the drones should go. Do the drones go 30 miles or do they go 60 miles? Do we detain people or do we give them ankle bracelets? These are the kinds of discussions and debates that we have between Democrats and Republicans. And one of the unique things about Nikos Poulantzas is he's writing about Europe in the 1970s. Well, obviously we're not Europe and we're not 1970s. This is 21st century post-racial United States. So the authoritarian turn in the United States that we are living, this is the conclusion of my book, and this is sort of my new thinking for my later projects. I'm thinking of it as a racial authoritarian statism, where you have the appearance of racial integration and democracy, but with an authoritarian police state. So yes, at this time when we've had 4 million deportations since 1990, this has happened and we've had more Latino elected officials than any time before. All right, we've had the most deportations out of Los Angeles under a Chicano mayor. We've had the most cases of police brutality at our borders at a time when the Border Patrol is more diverse than it ever has, right? So these elements of racial integration create the appearance of democracy, but with the authoritarian institutions of a police state. And this, for me, is something that I want to theorize further, and I welcome comments on this topic because I think this is a very important item for discussion. If you look at the Border Patrol, maybe 40% of them are Latino. You look at the California prison guards, good 30-40% of them are Latino. The list goes on in terms of repressive state institutions. So I'll leave it at that with respect to the Homeland Security State. So what is the way forward? And I say beyond reform and beyond elections, elections definitely have their place, and I don't want to diminish the importance of Latino electoral power, but I think this Latino electoral power, especially in the field of Latino politics, has been celebrated. There's a liberal assumption that the electoral power transits into social justice and transformation, and I don't think we can take that assumption for granted. I think we have to interrogate that assumption further. So what are the lessons from 2001 to 2012? And that's that traditional political power is not enough. In fact, throughout the book, I point to 2 major moments where the Latino migrant movement and its allies were victorious. That's the 2006 mega marches. That didn't happen because of the Hispanic Congressional Caucus. That happened because of oppositional migrant activists met in Riverside, California, and strategized on how they were going to defeat the Sensenbrenner bill, and they did. I get into a more nuanced discussion of that in the book. I understand that that could be contentious, but in the book I elaborate on that. And the other major victory for the Latino migrant movement is deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA. And again, DACA didn't come about because strategists in the Democratic Party and the Center for American Progress said, we need to give this to these young people. It was because young people actually broke with this consensus, broke with anti-migrant hegemony, and advanced a moral and intellectual leadership of their own that was able to momentarily compete with these dominant sectors. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the way I conceive, that I think the future of conceiving of Latino politics, and this here I want to speak not just for myself, but for the training that I got from Professor Rocco and a lot of us who are being trained under his guidance. The way a lot of us are thinking about Latino politics is not just Latino politics in the state sphere, but also Latino politics as a dual phenomenon, one that happens at the level of the state and civil society. I believe that Latino migrant social movements need to engage political parties and politicians nonetheless, but they must do so by maintaining their autonomy And when I say autonomy, I don't mean like the autonomous Zapatistas, they have nothing to do with the state. That's not an option when you have 4 million people that have been deported since 1990. But I am suggesting that if Latino migrant movements are going to engage with the state in the political sphere, they need to do so with a certain level of autonomy from those political parties. It's funny, this is really common sense in Latin America, where social movements are always talking about the importance of their autonomy. That's a discussion that needs to happen here in the United States. Okay, and I'll end with this point that I'm not. Some people say, well, you seem very pessimistic. I'm not pessimistic. Gramsci spoke of optimism, a pessimism of the mind, optimism of the spirit. And there is a spirit of Latino migrant activism that I think we haven't seen amongst Latinos since the 1960s, and maybe even, I would argue, and I don't want to offend no one, the 1960s were very much regional. This new spirit of Latino migrant activism is not regional. It's not just the Southwest and pockets in Chicago and Oregon. It's national. It's happening in Kansas City. It's happening in Florida. It's happening in New York, where I've learned a tremendous from these young activists. In fact, here's a picture of young activists at May 1st in New York City. But these Latino migrant activists, not just dreamers, but Latino migrant activists, many of whom refuse to call themselves dreamers, are fighting not just for immigration reform, folks, but they're really democratizing the United States. Much like the Black Civil Rights Movement, the Latino Civil Rights Movement sought to democratize the United States in the 1960s, these young people are beginning to make rights claims that go beyond just immigration reform. They're very much about the substance of a democracy today. Thank you.
Oh, I wish I had asked to go first. All that energy, and I have to follow up. I really am very honored that Alfonso invited me to be part of his homecoming, and I assigned his book in my class and saw how much it's really getting students to think about these issues, and I'm grateful that he wrote this book. I remember picking it up, and on the back cover, Juan Gonzales writes, quote, "It's a riveting and groundbreaking account of the modern battle over U.S. immigration policy." And I thought, I love social science research, but I don't know that I would ever call it riveting. And honestly, I started to read the book, and I noticed in chapter 2, I'm sitting kind of on the edge of my seat. Like, oh my goodness, is he really saying this? And I wrote to him because I think it takes a lot of courage to write this book, to really critically engage with what we all think we're doing in supporting immigrants and in really changing policies to be more humane. And given everything that's happening nationwide and globally, it's not easy to kind of start to pick apart and point out where even the best of intentions are not necessarily doing a whole lot to further our cause. And so I commend Alfonso for having the courage to do that. We are really in an important historical moment, mass record numbers of deportations, hundreds of thousands of families that are being forcibly separated, the very social fabric of entire communities, both immigrant and non-immigrant, being affected by all of this. And when you turn on the TV, and as I tell my students, and they have such a hard time understanding because all the messages we receive are just about these individual people who are choosing to break a law and choosing, criminal acts as they're being portrayed. We only talk about policies and this immigration problem at this individual level, and we think that all of the agency and all of the cause of it is from these individuals who just don't want to follow the rules. And so I so much appreciate that what Alfonso has done is to meticulously detail throughout the book how there are these connections across, as he showed you, right, across not just the state, but also civil society, groups that are acting to promote immigrant rights, and how this all, plays together to create the situation that we're in and to shape our understanding of it. I appreciated just that the detail that he uses in following the money, right? And really figuring out who is funding the think tanks that are producing the language that is then used in writing the policies, that is then also used to discuss these issues in the media, that eventually becomes so normalized that even within our own communities we're talking about it in this way. Even the ones who have family members who are undocumented are thinking, well, yeah, maybe my uncle shouldn't have crossed the border. He did break the law, It's gotten to that point, and it's so difficult because it's so much a part of our everyday life. It's so difficult to disentangle all of it and figuring out where is this coming from, and that's precisely what this book does. I also think that it's important to make the connections that with the regional focus. Again, part of that approach that we tend to use here in the U.S. of blaming the individuals forgets that this is regional, that this is global, and we forget that those very corporations that benefit from flexible, cheap labor here in the U.S. also benefit from maintaining policies as they are, or benefit from making sure that we continue to have flexible, cheap labor that they're going to benefit from, and so they can affect not just what happens within U.S. borders, but also policies that affect whether people need to get up and leave just to survive, right? I think that another area that as a sociologist I learned a lot about in this book is about the methods that he uses, and about making sure that we don't examine only one kind of actor in this broad field of immigration policies. And I appreciated hearing from directly the voices of people who have been deported to different countries, and people who are involved in different organizations, and at the same time I think it was really powerful, and I forget because the language can be so dense when you look at laws and policies. It was really powerful to see that you can tear these apart as well and see what words are we using, how are we starting to change the language so that we can frame the debate in their own terms, really. I also appreciated having grown up in LA and knowing, now having married into a family that has lived in the Inland Empire for many years, understanding just what the region means globally. I think we know that the IE, the Inland Empire, is there, but we don't necessarily think about it, and Alfonso does an excellent job of really locating the Inland Empire as a key place where so much of the global capitalist economy, bases itself on being able to have access not only to the cheap labor, but to the kind of space that they have there. And then the fact that we do kind of think of it as sort of the backyard of LA, and not work harder to organize and to make sure that we're keeping up with the rights, the needs of people there, was really important to understand that. And so you look at it, and if you go through the chapters, the chapter on the Inland Empire, a chapter on El Salvador, a chapter on Mexico, a chapter on New York and DC, and it's I think at first glance difficult to see how is this all going to gel together, and you realize that for such an important and overwhelming problem, it really is important to make those connections visible, and to really understand that we're not talking about a local problem, but really regional and global problem, and then it starts to make sense how these things all piece together. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that he also looks at resistance and examines the agency of immigrants and of allies, and not just in a way that puts them in a positive light, but in a critical way. And I think we deserve that, and we don't often do that. We deserve to really, as a community, be honest about what it is that we're aiming for, and how successful or not are we being in our attempts, right? And so I see it as a gift 2 immigrant rights activists to give us a chance to sit down and reflect on what we've been doing and how we're doing it, and to really allow that level of criticism to kind of sink in and think more deeply about where we go now. He closes the book, and I think it's really important, by emphasizing that immigration policy is not just about immigrants, and the way that we're doing things and how we move forward needs to really understand that this whole process is also about democratizing the entire country. And I think that's a key message, to reach beyond just the folks who have relatives who themselves are immigrants, to really think about how this is also a key part of what is happening in the country more broadly, and bring more people into the movement, into the discourse, and into moving forward. So with all of that, unbelievably, I thought at first I did end up agreeing with Juan Gonzales that it is a riveting and groundbreaking account, and I look forward to a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Actually, I'm just going to keep my comments brief. I'm mainly here as helping organizing the event with Dr. Rebecca Epstein. And thanks to Dr. Cho Noriega for allowing us to have the event. And then Dr. Rocco. And the Latin American Institute was gracious enough to offer food and drinks. So
Yes.
after this event, we want everybody to, where do people? In the back patio, there's
Some have gone already.
yeah, some are getting seconds already. So, and also I encourage everybody to read the book. Actually, I just finished reading the book. I've been traveling lately, and I must say, I just want to offer a few comments on behalf of the book and on behalf of Dr. Gonzales, also known as Alfonso. Is that this is an excellent book. It does challenge the traditional discourse on immigration debate that is taking place in this country. It is a radical book. And by radical, I mean it's one that is founded on issues of justice and dignity for immigrants. The great urbanist Michael Deere just wrote a book on the wall, that we should tear down the wall. And while everybody's talking about the Democrats, Republicans, and a lot of the reformists are talking about border security, we find people like Michael Deere arguing that we should tear down the wall, just like Reagan demanded that we tear down the Berlin Wall. In a similar fashion, Dr. Gonzales, who was born in Tijuana, arrived as an immigrant as a child, attended working class schools, attended the best universities in the world, UCLA, in a little school named Stanford up north, has been published by one of the best presses in the world, Oxford Press, is here to say that the migrant should not beg for forgiveness because he and she have done nothing wrong. They are here to claim their rights. They are not free riders. They are not here begging for handouts. They are hard, working class people that deserve to be treated with dignity. And this book, I will shortly write a review for it, but briefly, it engages the reader in a discussion outside of the pages of the LA Times, outside of the pages of the New York Times, and outside of the policy work that's done by a lot of organizations, a lot of liberal and mainstream organizations that act on behalf of the migrant, but when you think about it, they're really acting against the migrant. Because, as Dr. Gonzales argues, they fall into the trap of this binary framework where you have the good migrant and the bad migrant. Where the rich have always characterized the worker as the good worker and the bad worker. Where welfare, we should not give welfare, we should not give unemployment extension, because that encourages bad behavior. So we should not give amnesty, we should not allow citizenship because it encourages illegal, so-called illegal behavior. But while the Republicans and the anti-immigrant bloc that Gonzales characterizes argue against these people, at the same time they're benefiting from their labor. At the same time, when they go to eat, a busboy is cleaning their tables. When they go home, a domestica is cleaning their homes. When they are elderly and they can't care for themselves, a Salvadorian is cleaning them. A Mexican is cleaning them. A Filipina is nursing them. A Korean doctor is caring for them. But yet at the same time, they are pejoratized. They are treated like criminals. And this is why I recommend the book, because it gives an alternative framework to the existing discussion that many, in the majority of the mainstream liberal activists fall into. Where Obama has almost deported 2 million people, and they argue that migrants should pay back taxes. Why should they pay back taxes? What about all those wages that have been stolen from them? Are they going to get back taxes returned to them? So they argue that immigrants should learn English, but yet the government is taking away English classes. And there are few voices out there at the policy level from the Latino Congressional Congress and in many scholarly circles, outside of UCLA, of course, that argue in defense of the migrant or their basic human rights. And this is what this book is about. It is not a book about advocating for the criminalization of the majority or the benefit of the minority. And we see even the dreamers, they themselves have rejected the notion of amnesty for them. Because they say to themselves, and they say to others, if my parents can't get an amnesty, I cannot get amnesty. And what I appreciate about this book is Dr. Gonzales differentiates the different advocacy groups that are advocating in terms of the migrant debate. So you have the reformers, there are more established nonprofits, people from Washington, D.C., organized labor. It was organized labor, I must remind everybody, that approved of laws that took away benefits for migrants to begin with, where they are not eligible for a lot of benefits such as AFDC, now TANF, and other programs. So Dr. Gonzales in this book is very thorough and very meticulous and identifies the names, the groups, the actors, in terms of what are their role and what are their benefits, and at the end of the day, you know who benefits. In this country, there are winners and there are losers. And while immigrants and their advocates, or their so-called advocates, what I say to them and what Gonzales says to them is that they need to be careful what they're asking for. Because when they're asking for immigration reform, like the Gang of Eight that Gonzales writes about, they're asking for criminalizing the majority of the immigrants, where the majority of the immigrants, the 11 million, won't even qualify for a lot of the benefits that we're asking for. And that they're being viewed as sinners, as criminals, as having done something wrong, while at the same time, we as consumers are benefiting from their labor. And this is not a book about like traditional neoclassical economics where you look at individuals as rational individual behavior. This is a book that looks at structural issues, macro issues, and looking at globalization. Looking at the role of NAFTA and how NAFTA produces the migration, and then once they're here, then they're punished. Same thing with the Bracero program, where there are these programs that are established, that encourage migration, and when they're here, they're published and criminalized. And these are the topics, the issues that Dr. Gonzales, writes about in this excellent book, and I highly recommend it. So this is why we're here to discuss it, and as Dr. Ray Rocco was talking about, the brilliant book about Salvadoran Americans in this country, Lacy is something that we need to hear next quarter. I'm already signing her up without asking her. Because this is brilliant scholarship that is coming from scholars, emerging scholars, out of the best university in the world, to let people know that the personal is political, that we cannot separate ourselves as scholars, as students, from the community themselves, and that we should not forget. And what's ironic about someone like Gonzales, he epitomizes the American dream, because he started from Tijuana and he ended up at the best universities in the world and now a professor at CUNY, and he's rejecting it. He is committing class suicide and letting them know that I am no different than my brothers and sisters. I am no different than the janitor that's going to clean the center after we leave.
I still want to make it to associate.
Yeah.
I want the promotion.
Let's get him transferred.
For the record.
Don't get too radical. Hold back.
It's not quite suicide.
My reviewers are here. That's one thing we share in common. We're both comedians. When I first read the book, I thought it was like Oxnard Press. I said, Oxnard.
Oxnard.
You know how Chicanos don't believe in ourselves, like Oxford. And then when I saw Oxford, Alfonso, there must be a typo here. I believe that Alfonso's doing Oxford a great favor and not the other way around. And by everybody being here today and welcome him back to UCLA, especially now we have Mora in football, we're back in beating USC, that we're back on track of winning humane and just immigration reform. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the comments, and so I guess we want to open it up for questions. But just before that, I have a comment here. The Chavez Center had desperately needs a political scientist, as Abel Valenzuela has said, and now that I'm not able to join you, there's an excellent candidate for and will obviously, since I was one of the folks on the committee that helped bring in the first wave of folks, the spirit of what we wanted to create with that, Alfonso embodies, as I'm sure you know. So let me open up the. So that's a plug for my student.
Oh.
So,
Unofficial job talk.
Yeah, no, that's official. I'll email. So let me open it up for questions. Yes. Could you say your name?
Oscar Ochoa. I graduated from UCLA here in 2005, Chicano Studies, and currently working on a master's thesis at CSU doing sales. Question, should Mexico play a role in the debates, and if so, what role should they play?
This question was asked in New York by a group of scholars from the University of Puebla. And little did I know, they also work for Gobernación, which is basically the Mexican government. And I told them, perhaps prematurely, I told them no, that the Mexican government is part of the reason why the vast majority of us are here. Does the Mexican government have responsibilities to its nationals living in the United States in terms of its consular services? Absolutely. But is it the role of the Mexican government to negotiate an immigration reform? They're going to take that role on regardless. But I think this is where the oppositional sectors of the migrant movement need to be able to outmaneuver them, because the Mexican government, and this is well documented by scholars such as Gilbert Gonzales, the great Gilbert Gonzales, I think he's a great scholar at UCI. The Mexican government has very much been complacent in the formation of guest worker programs and is really much dependent on a remittance-based economy. And they don't want justice for migrants. They want relief from deportation so they can keep the remesas coming to Mexico. So are they going to play a role? Yes. Should the Latino migrant movement allow them to dominate that role? I hope not. But again, this is all open, because these are contentious politics, and it can unfold in any which way.
Can I just add, I mean, we also need to recognize that Mexico is part of the neoliberal regime.
Right.
And so we can't really expect it to be progressive in the sense that we're doing.
So just to follow up, if I may, because in early 20th century, let's say in the 1920s, the decline of anti-Mexican violence in the United States, obviously we're talking post-Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo, specifically lynching violence, declined because the United States and Mexico finally stepped in and said, you need to obviously treat our people better, but it had to do with establishing economic relations, and that's when you see the decline of anti-Mexican violence. So just thought I'd make that note.
Are you referring to Lázaro Cárdenas? After the Mexican Revolution?
Right, this was, the last lynching was in 1928, so it was probably prior to Cárdenas.
We had a revolutionary government in Mexico
Right.
at the time. The PRI hadn't become the PRI yet.
Right.
It was a revolutionary government. That was very different circumstances. But now we're talking about the PRI 2.0 under Enrique Peña Nieto. There was just this cumbre of this conference of North American leaders, and this is another topic of discussion. But the neoliberal reforms in Mexico with respect to Pemex, with respect to water, with respect to education, are very much preparing Mexico for entrance into these mega free trade agreements with the Pacific and with the European Union. Yeah. So the Mexican government, they're looking for a stabilization of circular migration, not for justice for migrants. They're two different things.
Sure.
But that's excellent point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us your name and what you study?
Ramon, and I'm in the urban planning department here, and I know Alfonso for some years. Thank you for the talk. Basically, what I want to ask you is, this is kind of for everyone, but for you specifically, by this question of hegemony, how does attacking immigrants affect kind of like governance within the United States? Is there a relationship in subjugating a group and as a way of like governing like most of us or people that are not immigrants, that are US citizens or they might be white or middle class? How does those two things, is there a relationship between oppressing a group or having a certain discourse or a state apparatus and within the idea of hegemony of how this government? I don't know if you can expand on that.
Yeah, well, hegemony is not just repression. Just to be very, very clear. I mean, straight domination and repression is not hegemony. When you have to bring out the military to do mass deportations and do them in the streets the way they did in the 1930s, where they're going to neighborhoods and round up anyone they can get, that's straight domination. Hegemony is consensual domination, and it requires that, and this is almost exact quote from Gramsci, that it requires that the interests of the subordinate groups be represented within the hegemonic order. So it's exactly providing upward mobility and access to power to Latino elected officials, to these think tanks in Washington, D.C. That's very much part of building this consensual domination. It's very much part of it. Now, I'm not saying that every elected official is going along with the anti-migrant bloc. There's, of course, just examples of people who are against it, like Raúl Grijalva in Tucson. Luis Gutierrez in his better days, not always, but on his better days, it's not so black and white.
It's brown.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Celia.
Can you speak up?
Sorry, my name's Celia Lacayo, and I'm a postdoc here at the IAC. I just want to say that I'm very proud of you, that we've gone back since Conciencia Libre, and as young scholars here, it's a very inspiring story and journey that you have. So I just wanted to say that. A lot of people have talked about the difference between deportations in terms of people that overstay visas and what the border enforcement means in terms of racialization and particular group. It seems that you were talking about that your next project is about racial authoritative state, and I just wanted to hear, or if you could elaborate on that.
Oh, great. Thanks for asking. Let me just do a couple slides over. You can find out more about my second project if you go have a website. They gave me this name, alfonsogonzales.com. But Reform Without Justice has got a Facebook page. You can follow me on Twitter. But the second book, Justice Denied, Mexican Central Americans and the Geopolitics of Asylum, is about the denial of Mexican and Central American asylum claims. Both Mexicans, Salvadorans, and Guatemalans, they lose over 90% of their asylum cases. Mexicans actually lose 99% of the time they lose their case. Out of the almost 10,000 Mexican asylum cases that were heard in 2013, only 1% were granted. Okay, so in the next book, I'm going, in a way it's a continuation of the first book, but I'm going to focus on the immigration court apparatus and how the denial of asylum is linked to the growth of migrant detention. And it's very clear because the way the asylum policies have changed, the same forces that have changed, they have moved the immigration debate to the right, have also moved asylum policy to the right since the 1980s. And that's something I want to get into the second book. Most likely also be with Oxford, or I don't know, maybe Cambridge will give me a shot. But that's the second book. The concept of authoritarian statism, right? The appearance of democracy, but with the authoritarian apparatus of a police state and the curtailing of civil liberties. I don't think, again, hegemony is not straight domination. It's consensual domination. And the only way you can have consensual domination in a country like the United States where the demographics are rapidly changing and you have a decrease of the Anglo-origin population and an increase of people of color is to make people of color very much part of those authoritarian institutions. From Latino elected officials to Latino police officers. And let's face it, for the few of us that make it to places like UCLA, a lot of us become lawyers, professors, but look at our cohorts, our contemporaries that went to Cal State LA or Cal State Long Beach. A lot of them become parole officers, a lot of them become police officers, right? There's more of them becoming part of the authoritarian police institutions than are becoming part of academia or the justice system through, on the criminal defense and immigration defense. So this is the trend, racial authoritarian statism. And I don't want to act like this is my concept. This is a concept that was very much developed by the late Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall was there's different, rest in peace, Stuart Hall, but there's different readings of Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall was very much concerned with Thatcherism. He was a Gramscian, he was a Marxist, but he was also an avid reader of Polanzas. And he talked about how in Britain you had a racial authoritarianism against mugging and immigrants in Britain, right? Where this discourse about mugging was very much one about blacks and immigrants in Britain. So again, this is not like an entirely new concept, but I think what is new here is I'm applying that to Latino politics, right? Being skeptical of, I think, what is this premature celebration of Latino political power, right? We assume there's more Latino elected officials. We're able to show more people voted in 2010 than in 2008. Here's the numbers, and that somehow that is linked to substantive democracy. Professor Valenzuela?
I'm wondering if you could comment on organized labor and their role in perhaps the national immigrant reform debate, but also the increasing connection that they're trying to establish with the worker center movement, and of course the worker center movement's connection in a very local civil society context. I'm just curious to see how you see it fit in your frame and your.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. That's an interesting. That's a very important development that we're seeing labor being transformed by the immigrant rights movement, right? In some ways, labor. We can't the same way we talk about the immigrant rights movement. We got talk. The way we can't speak of a homogeneous immigrant rights movement. We really can't speak of homogeneous labor, right? Because there's factions within the labor movement that have different positions on this. So someone like Eliseo Medina, SEIU, is, he went on a hunger strike for 744. He is willing to accept a guest worker program. Whereas someone like Pablo Alvarado, who's the head of the National Day Laborers Network, is very much critical of 744, calling for an immediate stop to the deportations. So I don't talk about
that particular, I don't make that particular point in the book, but in chapter 3 or chapter 2, I speak about the role of labor in the 2006 marches. Now, some folks contend that labor, if you speak to some of the folks in labor, they say we organized 2006, but 2006 was much more nuanced on that, and there was a lot. There's an actual part in the book where I interview someone from who at that time was with Local 1199, the Old Town restaurant workers, where he says, look, our union bosses were telling us don't go out there and support the boycott, but our meseros and our dishwashers, our waiters and our dishwashers telling us, are we gonna go? We're ready to march. So there's these contradictions within the labor movement itself, where the rank and file, the rebellious leadership, talking about not necessarily the rank and file member who is maybe a janitor, but the union organizer who is organizing that janitor will sometimes go against the union leadership and suffer consequences for that, in fact. So it's very nuanced and it's very contentious, right? That's why I speak about blocks, the anti-migrant bloc, the Latino social bloc, but always with the understanding that these are heterogeneous and contradictory internally. Thank you. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, what's that? A couple more questions?
This gentleman had a question over here.
Hi, Alexandro Hernandez, ABD Ethnomusicology.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Almost there. I have I'm curious, I haven't been able to read your book, but I'm curious about how you covered your work in Washington, D.C. I recently spent a year there. And in terms of the immigrant rights movement, I got to see many facets of it there. On one end, I saw the Latinos who are working on Capitol Hill, primarily Democrat, who are trying to negotiate with Republicans, right, or the lack thereof, but always in conversation with that political party, right? And it seems like it was constantly being trumped. And then there's the community organizations, and for example, National Day Labor Organizing Network, which you mentioned, Pablo Alvarado, and their branch over in Washington, D.C., and their efforts to halt deportations and their acts of civil disobedience right at the Capitol and other acts of civil disobedience. So my curiosity is how do you talk about Washington, D.C., and what organizations or people were you talking to?
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you're speaking about being in Washington, D.C., because I got a PhD in political science, and I had done lobbying, but I had never really spent time in D.C. It's one thing to do lobbying, you formally with a congressman, congresswoman, they give you coffee and they're polite, but it's another thing when you're sitting in a bar or a coffee shop with the organizer who's sitting there thinking, damn, we can't get what we want from these people, we gotta give them something. But there's something about being in DC that allows you to see that. So doing the on-the-ground research in DC was extremely important, because even though I was able to theorize more or less the direction of things moving in DC, it wasn't until I started to do that ethnographic work in DC, to go to the protests, to interview not just the person making $100,000 a year working for a major nonprofit, but literally interviewing dishwashers, day laborers. And I interviewed a variety of people. And in doing that, I realized that Washington, D.C. is a very difficult, it makes the most radical person become a moderate, and it makes moderates turn into Republicans. It's a politically conservative place, right? Even Andilon, some of the leadership in Andilon in D.C. is different than the leadership of Andilon in L.A. because of the realities of being in the city. So looking at this from a Gramscian perspective, I believe that one of the strengths of the immigrant rights movement is that its leadership is not all in Washington, D.C. One of the strengths is actually that its leadership is far from the centers of power. Because the closer you are to the centers of power, the more likely you are to reproduce the dominant discourse and be less willing to challenge and to really make counter-hegemonic demands. My esteemed colleague, Raul, Professor Moreno.
Raul Moreno, political science.
Political theory, in fact.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Alfonso. And it's good to see how the project has come to fruition. you know, and I remember it from the early stages as your dissertation, and then through the manuscripts, you know, like, and now it's, you know, just so great to see you and see it, you know, what it is today. You know, one of the things that I always appreciated about your work, you know, is the care in which you took in conceptualizing the civil sphere, and in particular in conceptualizing the cultural and intellectual work that went into creating the discursive parameters, you know, for, you know, the generation of consent, you know, particularly, you know, with relation to this authoritarian state, right? And so, you know, what I was thinking about, you know, is that in relation to your next project, you know, it seemed to me that an important side of contestation would be, you know, to how do we, you know, transform those, you know, normative parameters that have set up that discursive field. So what can be said or known about a particular subject, right? You know, and this is precisely what, you know, the intellectuals like Huntington were involved in, you know, because they created that discursive field, you know, and so, you know, to me, you know, part of when we talked about this, you know, part of the challenges, you know, in breaking that anti-migrant hegemony was to change the terms of the conversation, you know, like to break them, you know, so, because, you know, part of it was, you know, that intellectuals like Huntington would say, well, you know, what moral responsibility does the U.S. have, you know, like to institute a form of, you know, like reform that, you know, it in fact accomplishes these goals of justice, like, you know, Marion Young, you know, discusses, like Irish Marion Young discusses, as an elimination of human suffering or domination. Like, what should we, like, you know, after all, a nation state is bounded, you know, ideas of a common descent, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and these people are not part of this project. They're not part of this political project, nor do we
What
owe,
people, in
you know,
particular?
migrants.
Right.
You know, migrants are not part, you know, of this political project or self-understanding or identity as a nation. You know, like, so, you know, how do we then, so then the idea is, you know, in terms of a side of contestation in civil society where, you know, these ideas get produced, you know, like, what does that counter-hegemonic project look like where we reorder the terms of the conversation, you know, so that discursive field becomes, you know, like broken, you know, and open to rearrangement, you know, so that, you know, that was, I mean, this is an ongoing conversation between, you know.
Yeah, this is an ongoing conversation, and I can't say I know the answer to that, and I can tell you that there is no one answer to that, but there's many sites or spaces of contestation where I think these counter-hegemonic demands have been made. I think one sector is the indigenous sector of the migrant movement. The indigenous, and this is why throughout the book I tried to speak of migrants as much as possible versus immigrants, because I recognize that not all sectors of the immigrant rights movement consider themselves immigrants, and not just indigenous folks, but other global migrants as well. Like the Filipinos, for instance, not all Filipinos, but the Filipino migrant activists, they very much like to use the word migrant activist versus immigrant. But the indigenous sector of the migrant movement, they're making rights claims that get right back down to the formation of the nation state and the rights of discovery with Christopher Columbus and the papal bulls that come from the Vatican that establishes the first nation states in the Americas. And they're they're really making, and this is probably, you know, it sounds cliche in some sectors, but they are really making decolonial demands about the right of free movement in the Americas. There's another theorist, Kathleen Arnold, who also a theorist from UCLA in political theory. She has a great book on immigration, Immigration After 1996. She's theorizing the idea of post-national citizenship. Can we imagine a new form of political belonging that isn't just based on the nation state? It's based on these other notions. I know Professor Rocco is, has a forthcoming book on where he engages some of these questions. But with respect to the second book, there's one moment that I have to capture of it's an immigration court, right? So I don't think that the closer you are to the centers of power, the more likely you are to have a discourse that's within the parameters of the discursive field set up by the anti-migrant bloc. So it's no coincidence that you see the most conservative arguments being made in Congress or being made in lobbying county boards or local governments. Okay, but contestation
right? Politics is about the study of power, and power is contested everywhere. I'm not a Foucauldian. This is not Foucauldian, okay? But power is contested everywhere, and throughout the different sites of the state apparatus, you see these contestations. And one of those sites, for me, is in the migrant detention system and immigration court. Immigration court is a site of the Homeland Security State that I didn't get a chance to elaborate on the book, but it's one of the many faces of the Homeland Security State. And there was one moment in particular of a Guatemalan detainee who was held here in San Pedro. I can't say his name for, out of respect for his confidentiality, but this guy defended himself on an asylum claim. And all these immigration lawyers from the ACLU, from different places, wanted to help him because he had a good case that could win. And I remember going to visit him and him saying, I don't want these lawyers to mess up my case. I'm defending myself. And this guy defended himself through a translator. And in immigration court, if you're in immigration court, it's very much about making the case for asylum. And it's very, it's also a discursive field that's very much controlled. What arguments are permitted, what arguments are not. And all immigration attorneys will tell you, don't make it political. Don't talk about U.S. foreign policy. Don't talk about the role of the U.S. in your country, even though that's the elephant in the room, right? But this gentleman from Guatemala said, we could have had a democracy by 1954 in Spanish through a translator. The CIA overthrew Jacobo Arbenz. And he went over the history of U.S. intervention in Guatemala from 1954 until 1996 when he got deported. And the immigration attorneys who couldn't represent him because representing himself, but were in the room, were in horror, like, please don't say that, stop, don't stop. He had the bailiff crying, he had the attorneys crying, and he won his case. But he had the courage from migrant detention in San Pedro to break those discursive parameters. That's why it takes courage to break discursive parameters, not just in immigration court or in politics, but even in our academic work as well, I would add. He broke those discursive parameters and he said what needed to be said. He won his case. And he's actually out and he's an activist today helping other detainees. So in all those spaces, you have those fights happening.
Can I follow up on that question? So the reason Gramsci tells us to study hegemony is to find out how to build counter-hegemony, right? And that's the purpose. And you mentioned before that you consider your work sort of critical theory. Well, the essence of, the basis of critical theory is to discover emancipatory practices in what already exists that can then be the basis of organizing, right? Yeah. So I think that's the way I read your book. So I'm wondering, very few of us are willing to take the next step that I think you're already made, and certainly the second book, to call the U.S. an authoritarian state. I think it is. It's an authoritarian state. It has all of the trappings of democracy, but the policies have become more than repressive. They've become part of the hegemony, right? So the question I have for you is, what theoretical purchase do you think making that step would allow for those of us who are trying to do critical theory work? Because very few critical theorists, even in the U.S., would say the U.S. is authoritarian. I now, say that in my classes and in the book, and because I think it is. If you look at all the violations, it's unquestionably to me. But if you were to say that in a job talk, in political science, it would, yeah. So don't say that. But I can say that. But I can say that now, right? So I'm asking you now, partly as a mentor, to get you to think about what theoretical purchase do you get by making that step?
I'm sorry, I just saw my daughter, so I
okay. Okay.
She's only 4 months. Today she's 4 months.
She has a question?
She has a question.
She has a question.
She's already reading.
She's like,
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
They took her out. She was hating. They took her out.
And I'm thinking about future work, but also for the work for young scholars here, graduate students, who, Alfonso is one of those rare instances that we can learn from, that you can do emancipatory, critical advocacy research that's rigorous and solid. They're not inconsistent, which is what we're taught in graduate school. And I think, that's one of the great values of it. But anyhow, I'm wondering about, it's in the context of Gramsci's, argument that we have to learn from the existing system, and if it's becoming authoritarian, then what do we learn? Theoretically. I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this. So, you know what I'm asking, right?
Can you rephrase the question? Can you
Yeah,
answer?
okay. So, if as you're arguing here, I think you're arguing that the United States has, as an extension of your work with Poulantzas, that is like Hall with Thatcherism, that we are essentially an authoritarian democracy, if you can say that. That's
Right.
a contradiction in terms, but that's what we live in, contradictory institutions. So an authoritarian form of democracy, if you make that move, which you're obviously going to make here, what's the theoretical purchase? What avenues do you open up for rethinking these issues?
This particular move, right? This analysis of the authoritarian turn in the United States allows us to think of the politics of immigration control or migration control enforcement as part of a larger authoritarian turn that's not just about immigration. In fact, I started thinking about this when I was reading on the prison industrial complex. And most of the work on the prison industrial complex is a lot of excellent research. A lot of it's focused on African Americans. And I believe that's a face of, you don't have to call it the Homeland Security State, but it's the same state apparatus that has a set of discourses, a set of policies at the borders with respect to immigrants, but also has another set of discourses and a set of machinery, if you will, for mass incarceration and mass deportation and mass incarceration. If we begin to think of those as not separate things that, this affects Latinos and this affects blacks, as a larger system of state domination, of consensual domination, what the understanding of racial authoritarian statism allows us to do is to think about, how did this come about, and what are the ways that the political incorporation of blacks and Latinos into the American political system, how is that incorporation related to this authoritarian turn? And how is that related to neoliberalism? It allows us to ask these questions I don't think have been asked in a long time. Well, I don't think these questions have been asked.
Ever.
So again, I don't have the answers to this. This is something that I came to by way of conclusion of my work, and it's something that's been very difficult to really elaborate on. But I don't think we can separate mass incarceration from mass deportation and questions of democracy. It's an important field of study.
Do you want to
Maybe
any more questions or comments?
we have the reception in the back, so
Yeah.
maybe I could do 2 quick questions. No? Okay. All right.
Actually, they're hungry.
Yeah.
No, I do have a comment on that. I have a comment regarding what the question about about what's being discussed. I think what was being discussed here in terms of the book and making that step, it's something that I think is very important, and it gives people younger scholars, that strength to do it as well. If you look at Noam Chomsky, for example, one of the smartest men alive, he argues that the state is violent, that the United States is he goes as far as to say that the United States is a violent state, and to some degrees engages in terrorism. I think in your case, what it allows you to do is as an academic, and you're being protected by the press itself, by the academic press. So you have that protection of Oxford Press, supporting your arguments. in a sense validating it, even though we don't need validation, but in reality, this is what it does take, speaking about academia. What I must say, and this is in the book, I think that, to me, anything we say and we do in this country, there's consequences. When you write about these issues, you get hate email, you get threats. And this is something that all of us that write along these lines that we experience, even with the protection of the university. And just as a last comment on the book, I think the bravest part of the book is not the words or analysis, because other people, like I said, Chomsky and others have argued this, is that you had the courage to go to one of the most violent states in this country, in this world, in El Salvador, and now with Mexico's experience, and to interview people there, with the understanding that interview can cause you death. That interview can disappear you. As someone who grew up in housing projects in East LA, I myself would not do that, because I know that the consequences of just asking a judge a question, of asking an ex-gang member a question about his affiliations, will bring the death squads knocking on your door. And I think for that alone, we need to endorse and embrace this type of literature, of scholarship, because it opens the door for others to do likewise. Because by being affiliated with Oxford Press, by being affiliated with CUNY, by being affiliated with the University of California, you have that protection that other people don't have. But it gives people room to be critical. And if I must commend you on that act alone of going to El Salvador, asking questions, and putting that fear aside, just like the dreamers that cross the border and come back, knowing that they're going to get deported and detained because they might not come back. And I've known you for a long time, and when I read that, I said to myself, this is somebody that we need to support, and I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you're a product of university, and more than anything, I hope that you encourage others in this room to do likewise.
Thank you. I would just say that El Salvador wasn't that dangerous.
Thank you.
It was an inspirational place.
Let's make it seem like it was.
No, it was an inspirational place that has really shaped my scholarship. That there's an epistemology, a way of knowing the world, a way of understanding politics from El Salvador.
Are you from El Salvador?
That has very much shaped my politics,
Right.
and I think those of you who know me well know that's when Raul was reading the manuscript and he's like, I see the imprint of the Salvadoran in the book. And I was like, yeah.
But it's there though.
But it's been part of my.
But you can't deny it's there.
It's been part of my political and academic formation. To me, it was no more dangerous than. It's actually less dangerous than you saw the cover of the book.
Yeah, I thought.
Of these young activists who are confronting the border patrol, who are undocumented. Well, this is a picture that was inspired by a situation like that.
Right.
That takes more courage than flying in for a couple of weeks and doing interviews. For me, not to minimize the doing interviews, but thank you. I appreciate that. I've had some other brave moments, but that wasn't one. So let's talk more at the reception.
All right.